Picture this. You are choking on the smell of burning flesh and parchment. It is 1258, and you are standing in the ruins of Baghdad, the jewel of the world, now reduced to a mass grave. You are knee-deep in the Tigris River, but the water isn't flowing clear. It runs completely black, with the ink of 100,000 destroyed books, the accumulated knowledge of human civilization, dumped into the water by laughing men on horseback. Then the black water turns a thick, coagulated red. The bodies start floating past. Men, women, children, scholars, caliphs. You look up at the riverbank and see them, the architects of this apocalypse. They wear silk shirts under heavy leather armor, smelling of fermented mare's milk and dried blood. They don't look tired. They look bored. They have just slaughtered 1 million people in a matter of weeks, and they are already looking west, toward your home. You are witnessing the Mongol war machine, a meat grinder of flesh and geography that has never lost a war, never abandoned a siege, and never shown mercy. And they are coming for you. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand the sheer, paralyzing terror of the year 1260, you have to forget everything you know about standard medieval warfare. This was not a border dispute between rival kings. This was not a crusade fought over holy stones. This was an extinction-level event. For the past 40 years, the Mongol Empire had been expanding across the globe like a necrotic plague. From the frozen forests of Russia to the blistering deserts of Persia, every army that rode out to meet them was not just defeated, they were physically erased from existence. The Mongol war machine operated on a psychology of absolute, uncompromising terror. They did not conquer cities, they deleted them. If you surrendered immediately, you were taxed and absorbed into their meat shield. If you resisted, even for an hour, your entire population was systematically slaughtered. Your walls were dismantled, brick by brick, and your fields were salted so that nothing would ever grow there again. They were led by Hulagu Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, a man who viewed human beings the way a farmer views weeds. Under his command, the Mongols had just achieved the unthinkable. They had destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate. The Caliph himself was rolled up in a carpet and trampled to death by horses because the Mongols believed that spilling royal blood on the earth would offend the sky god. By the time the ashes of Baghdad cooled, the psychological back of the Middle East was broken. The greatest military minds of the 13th century genuinely believed that the Mongols were a divine punishment, demons summoned from the underworld to cleanse the earth of human sin. Resistance was mathematically and philosophically impossible. The massive, heavily armored knights of Europe had already been slaughtered by Mongol scouts. The elite assassins of Syria had been starved out of their impenetrable mountain fortresses. The Muslim world was shattered, leaderless, and drowning in its own blood. There was only one major power left standing in the path of the Mongol tsunami. Far to the west, sitting at the gateway to Africa, was the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. They were the final roadblock. If Egypt fell, the entire African continent would burn, and after Africa, the Mongols would inevitably turn their horses north, sweeping into a divided, technologically inferior Western Europe. The fate of global civilization literally hung in the balance, resting entirely on the shoulders of the Mamluks. But here is the brutal, deeply ironic twist of history. The men waiting in Egypt to fight the Mongols were not born as royalty. They were not defending their ancestral homeland. They were kidnapped children, bought and sold like cattle. Forget the traditional concept of a slave. When you hear the word slave in the context of the 13th century Middle East, do not picture a starving captive breaking rocks in a quarry or sweeping the floors of a palace. Picture a human weapon, an apex predator, stripped of its humanity and reassembled into a killing machine. These were the Mamluks, and they are the greatest, bloodiest irony in the history of warfare. To understand why these men were the only force capable of looking the Mongol apocalypse in the eye without blinking, you have to look at how they were built. The story of the Mamluks begins with the Mongols themselves. As the Mongol war machine ground its way across the Eurasian steppes, it systematically butchered the nomadic Kipchak Turkic tribes. The adults were slaughtered and left to rot in the sun, but the children, the fierce, resilient boys of the steppes, were scooped up like loose change. They were thrown into wooden carts, chained together by their necks and dragged to the slave markets of the Black Sea. Here they were sold to merchants who shipped them across the Mediterranean to the Ayyubid sultans of Egypt. The Mongols thought they were simply cleaning up their borders and making a quick profit. In reality, they were mass-producing their own executioners. When a boy arrived in Cairo, he was typically between 8 and 12 years old. He was entirely alone. His family was dead, his homeland was gone, and his birth name was erased. He was placed into a brutal military academy located on an island in the Nile River. This was not a school, it was a survival of the fittest meat grinder. The curriculum was called the Furusiya, an exhaustive, bone-crushing martial code. For years, these boys were subjected to agonizing physical conditioning. They were forced to ride wild horses bareback until their thighs bled. They practiced firing heavy composite bows at a full gallop, turning their fingers into calloused hooks of dead skin. They swung heavy iron maces and slashed with curved swords until the muscles in their backs resembled coiled steel cables. But the physical training was only half of the process. The true genius of the Mamluk system was psychological. By stripping these boys of everything, the system ensured that their only identity was violence, and their only family was the men bleeding next to them. They were converted to Islam, but their true religion was warfare. They were deliberately isolated from the native Egyptian population. They weren't supposed to have civilian friends, they weren't supposed to understand mercy, and they certainly weren't supposed to feel fear. They were trained to be a hyper-lethal brotherhood, loyal only to their master and their fellow slaves. Eventually, this system worked too well. You cannot forge an army of flawless, trauma-hardened psychopaths, hand them the keys to your armory, and expect them to remain docile servants forever. The Mamluks realized a very simple, brutal truth. The men who hold the swords hold the power. In 1250, just a decade before the Mongol invasion, the Mamluks turned on their masters. They didn't stage a polite political coup. They hacked the reigning sultan to pieces, slaughtered anyone who stood in their way, and seized the throne of Egypt for themselves. It was an unprecedented historical anomaly. The slaves became the kings, the property took over the estate, and the man who rose to the top of this cutthroat, blood-soaked hierarchy was Sultan Qutuz. Qutuz was a Kipchak Turk who had been sold in the slave markets of Damascus. He had the lash marks on his back and the scars on his knuckles to prove it. Now in 1260, as the terrified refugees flooded into Cairo screaming about the invincible Mongol demons destroying the Middle East, Qutuz did not panic. He wasn't a soft, inbred aristocrat terrified of losing his velvet cushions. He was a survivor of the worst the world had to offer. When he looked at the approaching Mongol horde, he didn't see an unbeatable force of nature. He saw the very people who had murdered his family, stolen his childhood, and sold him into bondage. The Mongols were about to hit a brick wall made of their own victims, and hell was coming with them. To understand the psychological warfare of the 13th century, you must look at the mind of Hulagu Khan. He was a man who did not believe he was fighting wars. He believed he was executing the will of the cosmos. In the Mongol worldview, dictated by the Tengri, the sky god, there was only one legitimate ruler on earth, and that was the Great Khan. Therefore, any nation that resisted Mongol expansion was not an enemy combatant. They were rebels. They were unnatural aberrations disrupting the universal order, and they had to be exterminated. This wasn't just arrogance, it was a weaponized theology of absolute terror. Hulagu did not just want your land, he wanted your mind to break before his cavalry even crested the horizon. By the spring of 1260, Hulagu had established his iron grip on the Levant. His horses were grazing on the blood-soaked plains of Syria, his soldiers resting after turning the legendary cities of Aleppo and Damascus into smoking slaughterhouses. Hulagu looked south toward Egypt. It was the last functioning state in the Islamic world, the final flickering candle of resistance before the vast continent of Africa. But Hulagu didn't immediately order a march. He didn't need to. He simply picked up a pen. He sent a delegation of 4 envoys riding down the coast, across the scorching sands of the Sinai Desert, and straight into Cairo. When these Mongol riders trotted through the massive stone gates of the Egyptian capital, the civilian population shrank back in absolute horror. The streets of Cairo were already choking with thousands of starving, traumatized refugees who had fled the destruction of Syria. These refugees had spread stories of Mongol atrocities that defied human comprehension, stories of pyramids made from severed heads, of pregnant women cut open, of entire cities systematically erased. The mere sight of the Mongol armor sent a shockwave of panic through the markets. But the envoys ignored the peasants. They rode with the arrogant swagger of executioners arriving at a prison. They marched directly into the royal citadel of Sultan Qutuz, refusing to bow, refusing to show any deference, and unrolled a letter that remains one of the most chilling, beautifully written death threats in human history. The words on that parchment were a masterpiece of intimidation, designed to bypass the armor of the body and directly poison the mind. Hulagu wrote, "From the King of Kings of the East and West, the Great Khan, to Qutuz the Mamluk who fled to escape our swords." Right from the opening line, Hulagu denies Qutuz his royal title. He reminds the Sultan of his origins, calling him nothing but a runaway piece of property. The letter then pivots to a promise of total, inescapable annihilation. Hulagu painted a picture of a world already dead. We have conquered vast areas, massacring all the people. You cannot escape from the terror of our armies. Where can you flee? What road will you use to escape us? Our horses are swift, our arrows sharp, our swords like thunderbolts, our hearts as hard as the mountains, our soldiers as numerous as the sand. Fortresses will not detain us, nor armies stop us. Your prayers to God will not avail against us. We are not moved by tears nor touched by pity. Only those who beg our protection will be safe. Hasten your reply before the fire of war is kindled. Read those words carefully. Try to hear them echoing in a torch-lit room in the Middle Ages. And this is not standard political posturing. It is a psychological vivisection. It is the voice of an apex predator that has literally never been stopped, calmly informing you that you are about to be eaten. Hulagu was counting on the sheer, crushing gravity of his reputation to shatter the Egyptian defense. He fully expected the Mamluk leadership to react the same way the kings of Eastern Europe and the caliphs of Baghdad had reacted, with paralyzing panic. He expected the emirs to turn on each other, to gather their hidden gold, and to scramble for ships to flee across the Mediterranean. He was playing a game of geopolitical chess where his opening move was simply turning over the board. But the Great Khan had made a fundamental, fatal miscalculation. He was using a psychological blueprint designed to break the minds of aristocrats. The Mongol terror tactics worked perfectly against fat, perfumed lords who had soft beds, generational wealth, and everything to lose. Hulagu failed to realize that the men sitting in the war room in Cairo did not have a single drop of royal blood among them. Sultan Qutuz and his generals did not grow up in palaces. They grew up in the dirt, wearing iron chains, bleeding under the whips of the slave drivers in the steppes. You cannot use the threat of trauma to break a man whose entire psychological foundation is built on trauma. As the Mongol envoys stood in the throne room, waiting for the Mamluk Sultan to fall to his knees and beg, they were met with something they had never encountered before. They were met with the dead, hollow, unblinking silence of men who had long ago forgotten how to be afraid. The silence in the citadel of Cairo is heavy, suffocating, and thick with the stench of pure panic. Sultan Qutuz rolls up the parchment. He looks around the war room. The great emirs of Egypt, the most hardened veteran killers in the Islamic world, are shifting uncomfortably in their heavy armor. Some of them are already calculating the fastest route to the Libyan desert. They are whispering about loading their gold onto ships, about abandoning the city, about paying any tribute the Mongols demand. Qutuz listens to this cowardice, and then he does something that completely shatters the tension. He does not argue, he does not plead, he simply makes a decision that will either save human civilization or guarantee its complete, fiery annihilation. Qutuz draws his sword and slams the steel onto the table. He looks his generals in the eye and tells them that they can take their gold and hide in the sand like dogs, but he is going to fight. He reminds them exactly who they are. They are Mamluks. They were born in blood, raised in iron chains, and they will not die on their knees. If nobody else will ride out to meet the apocalypse, Qutuz declares he will do it alone. It is a masterclass in aggressive leadership, a psychological shockwave that snaps the emirs out of their paralysis. Shame is a powerful motivator, but what Qutuz does next goes far beyond a motivational speech. He needs to make sure that no one in that room can ever change their mind. He needs to burn the boats. The 4 Mongol envoys are still waiting in the courtyard, wearing their silk and leather, radiating the arrogant immunity of the untouchable. They expect to be handed the keys to the city and showered with silver. Instead, they are violently grabbed by the palace guards, dragged to the rough stone floor, and forced onto their knees. The execution of a diplomat was considered the ultimate taboo in the medieval world. Genghis Khan had once eradicated an entire empire of millions just because they executed his merchants. To kill a Mongol envoy was to invite a level of retributive violence that borders on the biblical. Qutuz knows this. That is exactly why he gives the order. He doesn't just have them quietly beheaded in a back room, he orders them cut in half at the waist. It is a slow, agonizing, graphically violent execution designed to send a very specific message. You do not terrify us, you disgust us. Once the bodies stop twitching in the courtyard, the heads of the 4 envoys are collected and dragged through the dirt of the streets. They are taken to Bab Zuwayla, the massive, towering stone gates of Cairo. There, the Mamluks hammer thick iron spikes through the skulls of the Mongol diplomats and nail them to the heavy wood for the entire city to see. Imagine being a traumatized refugee in Cairo on that day. You have spent weeks running from invincible monsters, terrified of your own shadow, and suddenly you look up at the city gate and see the monsters bleeding from the wood. It is a profoundly deliberate act of psychological counter-warfare. Qutuz is showing his people and his own army that the Mongols are not demons from the underworld. They are not ghosts, they are just meat and bone, and they can be butchered just like anyone else. By spiking those heads, Qutuz has officially declared total, uncompromising war on the greatest military superpower in human history. There is no negotiating now. There is no possibility of surrender. The Mongol war machine will not stop until every brick in Cairo is pulverized into dust. Knowing that the clock is now ticking, Qutuz makes another strategically suicidal decision. He does not wait behind his massive city walls. He knows that no city has ever survived a prolonged Mongol siege. If you let the Mongols surround you, you are already dead. So Qutuz forces his terrified emirs to empty their personal treasuries to fund the campaign. He rallies the heavily armored Mamluk cavalry, and he marches his army out of the safety of Egypt. He leads them straight into the scorching heat of the Sinai Desert, marching north toward Palestine. The slaves are actively hunting the apex predators. The year is 1260, and the blistering heat of the Palestinian summer is baking the earth. Sultan Qutuz has force-marched his Mamluk army out of Egypt, up the Mediterranean coast, and into the Jezreel Valley. He is not wandering aimlessly. He is hunting. The location he chooses for this apocalyptic showdown is no accident. It is a place called Ain Jalut, which translates to the Spring of Goliath. History loves a heavy-handed metaphor, and the irony here is impossible to ignore. A massive, seemingly invincible giant is about to step into the valley, and waiting for them is an army of traumatized outcasts holding a very deadly rock. But this isn't a biblical fairy tale, and the Mamluks aren't relying on divine intervention. They are relying on geography. The valley of Ain Jalut is flanked by the steep, rugged slopes of Mount Gilboa. It is a natural funnel, a geographical choke point that completely neutralizes the Mongols' greatest advantage, the open steppe. The Mongol war machine was designed for infinite horizons, where their light cavalry could outflank, encircle, and drown their enemies in a tidal wave of arrows. By positioning his army in this narrow valley, Qutuz is forcing the Mongols to fight in a phone booth. He is stripping away their mobility and forcing a brutal, head-on collision. To pull this off, Qutuz relies on his vanguard commander, a man who is arguably the most terrifying individual on the field that day. His name is Baybars. If you were to look into Baybars' face, you would understand immediately why men followed him into hell. He was a massive, imposing Kipchak Turk with a booming voice and a severe cataract in one of his blue eyes that turned it a cloudy, dead white. Decades earlier, in the slave markets of Damascus, that blind eye had actually lowered his price. The merchants thought he was defective goods, but on the battlefield, it gave him the visage of a literal demon. Baybars is the ultimate weapon against the Mongols for one very simple reason. He shares their blood. He was born on the same freezing steppes. He learned to ride on the same rough-haired ponies. He understands the physical mechanics of the composite bow just as intimately as the men he is about to slaughter. When the European knights and Middle Eastern kings fought the Mongols, they were completely baffled by the enemy's tactics. They didn't understand the blinding speed, the silent battlefield communication, or the psychological warfare. Baybars understands all of it. He has read the Mongol playbook because it is his playbook too. As the Mamluk vanguard sets up camp near the spring, Baybars and Qutuz devise a strategy that borders on suicidal brilliance. They know the Mongol detachment approaching them is led by Kitbuqa, Hulagu Khan's most trusted general. Kitbuqa is a seasoned, ruthless killer, but he suffers from the same fatal disease that infects the entire Mongol high command. Absolute, blinding arrogance. He has never tasted defeat. He doesn't respect the Mamluks. He views them merely as rebellious runaway property. Baybars knows that Kitbuqa will not hesitate to charge headlong into the valley the moment he sees an enemy banner. So, the trap is set. Qutuz takes the vast majority of the heavy Mamluk cavalry, thousands of heavily armored men on massive war horses, and hides them in the dense, wooded hillsides of Mount Gilboa and the surrounding high ground. They sit in the suffocating heat, iron armor baking in the sun, physically holding their horses' snouts so they don't whinny and give away the position. Down in the valley floor, standing in plain sight right near the spring, Baybars waits with a small, highly visible vanguard. He is the bait. His job is to look like a desperate, foolish detachment that just stumbled into the wrong neighborhood. He is going to invite the greatest army in the world to charge straight at him, and he has to hold his nerve, looking death in the face until the jaws of the trap finally snap shut. Kitbuqa, the undefeated Mongol commander, crests the ridge and looks down into the baking valley of Ain Jalut. He sees Baybars sitting near the spring with only a fraction of the Mamluk army. To Kitbuqa, this is an insult. He doesn't see a tactical ambush. He sees a mop-up operation. He immediately orders his light cavalry to charge. This is the exact moment the Mongol war machine usually wins. They sweep in like a flock of razor-bladed starlings, deafening their enemies with a relentless barrage of arrows, breaking their defensive lines and running them down in the ensuing panic. It is a psychological algorithm of violence that has worked perfectly from the borders of China to the forests of Poland. But as the Mongols thunder toward the Mamluk vanguard, the algorithm utterly fails. The Mamluks do not flinch, they do not break formation. Remember, Baybars and his elite fighters are Kipchak Turks. They were born on the same freezing grass as the men charging at them. They know exactly how far a composite bow can shoot, they know exactly how the Mongols feint, and most importantly, they know the fundamental weakness of the entire Mongol military apparatus. It isn't their armor, and it isn't their tactics, it is their horses. The Mongol rider is essentially a centaur. Sever the connection between the man and the beast, and the deadliest soldier on earth becomes a clumsy, bow-legged man stranded in the mud, wearing too much heavy leather. To permanently sever that connection, the Mamluks have brought something the Mongols have never faced before. It is a secret weapon that does not rely on kinetic energy or sharp steel. It relies on pure, unfiltered sensory overload. As the Mongol cavalry closes the distance, preparing to unleash their devastating arrow storm, the Mamluk front lines suddenly step aside. Behind them are men holding crude, incredibly thick iron tubes packed tightly with a volatile mixture of saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal. These are the Midfa, the world's earliest handheld cannons. The Mamluks lower the iron tubes and touch burning slow matches to the touch holes. What happens next changes the acoustic reality of warfare forever. There is no single projectile that can pierce 1,000 men at once, but sound can. A deafening concussive roar rips through the valley, echoing off the steep stone walls of Mount Gilboa and multiplying in intensity. A massive, suffocating cloud of thick white smoke erupts from the Mamluk lines, accompanied by a blinding flash of fire. They are not necessarily trying to shoot the Mongol riders with lead balls. They are shooting the air. They are weaponizing the dragon's breath. You can train a war horse to ignore the metallic tang of blood. You can train it to ignore the screams of dying men and the chaotic clash of swords. But you cannot biologically train a horse to ignore a sudden, explosive shockwave of fire and burning sulfur that sounds like the sky itself is tearing apart. The auditory processing of a horse is highly sensitive, evolved over millions of years to detect the subtle snap of a twig from a hidden predator. When hit with the localized volcanic blast of a midfay, the horses of the Mongol vanguard experience an instant, catastrophic psychological breakdown. The charging Mongol line disintegrates into pure kinetic chaos. Thousands of massive, panicked animals rear up simultaneously, their eyes rolling back in their skulls, completely ignoring the desperate commands and violent pulling of their riders. They violently buck, twist, and slam into each other at 30 miles an hour. The invincible Mongol cavalrymen, the arrogant conquerors who had just erased the Middle East from the map, are suddenly and violently thrown from their saddles. They are trampled to jelly under the iron-shod hooves of their own terrified mounts. The neat, deadly formation becomes a thrashing meat grinder of snapped femurs, crushed ribs, and blind panic. Kitbuqa watches from the rear, completely paralyzed. For the first time in his entire life, the environment is not bending to his will. His horses are screaming, his vanguard is a trampled, bloody mess, choking on sulfur, and the smoke is clearing to reveal Baybars, still sitting there, completely unfazed. The monster has finally met a bigger monster, and the real slaughter hasn't even begun. The thick, sulphurous smoke of the hand cannons begins to clear, revealing a valley floor painted with the blood of shattered Mongol horses. Kitbuqa, the undefeated general of the apocalypse, wipes the gritty dust from his eyes and stares at the carnage. He is not terrified. He is absolutely, homicidally enraged. No one does this to the Great Khan's army. No one humiliates the conquerors of the world. He looks across the field and sees Baybars, the one-eyed Mamluk commander, sitting calmly on his horse amidst the dispersing white smoke. Kitbuqa raises his sword, his voice tearing through his throat as he orders the entire might of his remaining forces to charge and crush this insignificant vanguard into the dirt. But Baybars does not wait for the impact. He does not brace his men for a heroic final stand. Instead, he does something that makes Kitbuqa smile, a jagged, bloody smile. Baybars turns his horse around and runs. The Mamluk vanguard breaks their defensive formation, whipping their mounts and fleeing in apparent terror deeper into the funnel of the Jezreel Valley. To understand what happens next, you have to understand the sheer mechanical difficulty of the feigned retreat. It is the single most dangerous tactical maneuver in the history of warfare. It requires you to turn your back on an army of professional killers who are actively shooting at you and pretend to panic without actually panicking. If even a fraction of your soldiers genuinely lose their nerve, if the adrenaline of flight overpowers their discipline, the fake retreat instantly devolves into a catastrophic, disorganized slaughter. It is a psychological tightrope walked over a pit of spears. The Mongols basically invented this maneuver. They had perfected it for decades to draw out European knights and crush them. But Baybars is about to take the Mongols' own masterpiece and strangle them with it. The Mamluks are not conscripted peasants. They are brainwashed, hyper-disciplined products of a slave soldier meat grinder. When Baybars orders them to flee, they do not break. They retreat with the terrifying synchronized precision of a flock of birds. They keep their shields angled perfectly backwards to deflect the whistling volley of Mongol arrows, all while maintaining an exact speed that keeps them just inches out of reach of the Mongol swords. They are dangling a piece of meat in front of a starving wolf, pulling it back right as the jaws snap shut. Kitbuqa takes the bait completely. His arrogance, the fatal psychological disease of the Mongol high command, completely blinds his tactical judgment. He sees the enemy running, and centuries of predatory steppe instinct take over. He does not send scouts up the surrounding hills. He does not secure his flanks. He simply orders a relentless full-speed pursuit. He whips his heavy cavalry forward, desperate to run Baybars down and make him pay in blood for the insult of the explosions. The Mongol war machine thunders deeper and deeper into the narrow confines of Ain Jalut, completely consumed by the bloodlust of the chase. They are moving so fast, deafened by the pounding of 10,000 hooves, that they do not look up. They do not look at the densely wooded slopes of Mount Gilboa, rising sharply on either side of them. If they had stopped for just 5 seconds and listened to the wind, they might have heard the terrifying sound of absolute silence. Hidden in those trees, baking inside heavy iron chainmail, under the unforgiving Palestinian sun, are tens of thousands of Mamluk heavy cavalrymen led by Sultan Qutuz. They have been sitting motionless for hours. The heat is agonizing. The sweat is pooling in their boots. They are gripping their weapons so tightly their knuckles are bone white, literally holding the jaws of their massive war horses shut with their bare hands to prevent a single stray whinny from giving away their position. They watch through the branches as the entire Mongol army gallops right past them, willingly walking headfirst into the center of a geographical kill-box. Down on the valley floor, Baybars reaches a predetermined marker. He pulls violently on his reins. The fleeing Mamluk vanguard suddenly stops, pivots in perfect mechanical unison, and lowers their lances. The retreat is over. The trap is sprung. Kitbuqa realizes in one horrifying, freezing second that he is no longer the hunter. The moment the Mongol vanguard commits to the pursuit, the air in the valley of Ain Jalut changes. The rhythmic thumping of Mongol hooves is suddenly drowned out by a sound that feels like the earth itself is screaming. From the high wooded ridges of Mount Gilboa, a single piercing trumpet blast shatters the silence. This is the signal. Before Kitbuqa can even process the sound, the tree line erupts. Thousands of Mamluk heavy cavalrymen who had been sitting in the suffocating heat like iron statues suddenly burst from the shadows. They aren't just riding, they are falling like an avalanche of steel. They hit the Mongol flanks with the force of a tectonic shift. This is the nightmare scenario for any light cavalry army. Being caught in a confined space, stripped of your momentum, and slammed from the side by 3 tons of armored horse and man. The Mongol lines don't just bend, they shatter. The sheer physics of the collision is horrific. Mamluk lances thick as a man's arm punch through leather armor and ribs like they are made of wet parchment. But the Mongols are not amateurs. Even as they are being crushed, their legendary discipline kicks in. They don't flee. They turn their horses in the blood-slicked mud and begin to fight with a suicidal, cornered animal ferocity. The center of the valley becomes a grinding wheel of flesh and iron. In the middle of this swirling vortex of death, Sultan Qutuz does something that few kings in history would ever dare. He realizes that his men, despite their training, are starting to waver under the sheer, terrifying intensity of the Mongol counterattack. The Mongol center is holding. They are beginning to push back, their curved sabers carving a path through the Mamluk ranks. The momentum of the trap is stalling. Qutuz doesn't shout an order from the safety of the rear. He reaches up, unbuckles his heavy steel helmet, and hurls it into the dirt. He wants his men to see his face. He wants them to see that their sultan is human, that he is bleeding, and that he is not afraid to die with them. He stands up in his stirrups, his voice booming over the roar of the cannons and the screams of the dying. "O Islam, Ya Allah, grant your servant Qutuz victory over the Mongols." He spurs his horse directly into the thickest part of the Mongol line. It is a suicidal charge, a moment of pure, unadulterated madness that electrifies the Mamluk army. When the slave soldiers see their king charging without a helmet, inviting an arrow to the brain just to show them the way, the psychological dam finally breaks. The Mamluks stop being men, they become a force of nature. Kitbuqa, seeing his army being systematically dismantled, refuses to retreat. His horse is killed from under him. He continues to fight on foot, covered in the blood of his own men, swinging his sword until his arms are heavy as lead. When he is finally surrounded and tackled to the ground, he doesn't beg for mercy. He looks up at Qutuz with the cold, dead eyes of a man who still believes he is a god. He tells Qutuz that even if he dies, the great Khan's vengeance will turn Egypt into a desert. Qutuz doesn't hesitate. He doesn't trade insults. He gives the order. And the head of the man who thought he was invincible is struck from his shoulders. For the first time in 40 years, the Mongol tide has not just been slowed, it has been decapitated. The dust of Ain Jalut finally settles, but the air does not smell of victory. It smells of copper, scorched earth, and the rotting hubris of an empire. For the first time in history, a Mongol army has not just been defeated, it has been annihilated in a set-piece battle. The invincible shadow that had swallowed half the world has finally hit a wall it couldn't break. But if you think this victory led to a golden age of peace and brotherhood, you don't understand the Mamluks. In their world, the end of a war is simply the opening bell for a more intimate kind of slaughter. Sultan Qutuz is at the height of his power. He has saved Egypt, he has saved Islam, he has saved the very concept of Western civilization from being trampled into the dirt by Mongol ponies. As the army begins the long march back to Cairo, Qutuz is likely dreaming of a hero's welcome, of palm fronds in the streets, and his name being shouted from the minarets. But riding just a few paces behind him is Baybars, the one-eyed commander of the vanguard. Baybars isn't thinking about parades, he is thinking about a promise. Before the battle, Qutuz had allegedly promised Baybars the governorship of Aleppo as a reward for his suicidal bravery. Now that the danger has passed, Qutuz hesitates. He realizes that giving a man like Baybars a massive power base in Syria is like giving a wolf the keys to the sheepfold. He denies the request. It is the last mistake Qutuz will ever make. A few days later, during a hunting trip on the way back to Egypt, the tension snaps. In a scene that feels like something out of a Shakespearean tragedy, Baybars approaches the Sultan under the guise of a loyal soldier. He asks to kiss the Sultan's hand. As Qutuz reaches out, Baybars grips the hand with the strength of a vice, and his fellow conspirators emerge from the shadows with drawn daggers. There is no epic duel, there are no last words. Qutuz, the savior of the world, is hacked to death in the sand by the very men he just led to glory. Baybars walks into the royal tent, sits on the throne, and effectively says, "I killed him, I am the Sultan now." And because the Mamluks are a society built on the raw, cold meritocracy of violence, the other generals simply shrug and bow. The man who was too dangerous to be a governor is now the king of Egypt. Under Sultan Baybars, the Mamluk Sultanate becomes a fortress state. He spends the rest of his life turning the Middle East into a graveyard for his enemies. He systematically wipes the remaining Crusader states off the map, tearing down the great castles of the Levant stone by stone so they can never be used against him. He creates a sophisticated postal system, a massive standing navy, and a spy network that makes the Mongols look like amateurs. He ensures that when the Mongols inevitably return for revenge, and they do return many times, they find a land that is no longer a collection of squabbling cities, but a unified wall of steel. Ain Jalut changed the DNA of the world. If the Mamluks had failed that day in 1260, there was nothing left to stop the Mongols from reaching the Atlantic. The Renaissance, the Age of Discovery, the very fabric of the modern West might have been strangled in its crib. We live in a world shaped by the fact that on a hot September morning, a group of kidnapped slaves decided they were tired of running. They proved that no empire is too big to fail, no horse is too fast to catch, and no God-given destiny can survive a well-placed ambush. History isn't made by those who follow the rules, it's made by those who are brutal enough to rewrite them in the blood of their masters. We often look at history as a series of inevitable dates on a map, but the truth is far more fragile. History is made of moments where a single no changed the trajectory of the species. Ain Jalut was that moment. It was the day the world stopped being a buffet for the Mongol Empire and became a battlefield where they could actually lose. But the legacy of this battle isn't just about military tactics or the introduction of gunpowder. It's about the psychological liberation of the human spirit. Before 1260, the Mongols weren't just an army, they were a supernatural force. Their propaganda was so effective that entire cities would surrender and march themselves to their own executions because they believed resisting the Khan was resisting the will of God. The Mamluks shattered that myth. They proved that the scourge of God bled red, just like everyone else. By successfully defending the gates of Africa, the Mamluks allowed the Islamic world to preserve its golden age of medicine, mathematics, and philosophy. They provided the breathing room for Western Europe to continue its slow climb out of the Middle Ages, unaware that their entire future had been secured by a group of Turkic slaves in a dusty Palestinian valley. The Mamluk Sultanate would go on to rule for nearly 3 centuries, standing as the preeminent power of the Mediterranean. They were a strange, brutal, and effective meritocracy, a society where the highest office in the land was reserved not for the son of a king, but for the most capable survivor of the slave barracks. They were a reminder that power doesn't always come from a bloodline. Sometimes it is forged in the fire of shared trauma and absolute discipline. But there is a final, haunting lesson in the story of Qutuz and Baybars. It's a warning about the nature of the monsters we create to fight our enemies. The Mamluks were the only force capable of stopping the Mongols because they were, in many ways, just as cold and just as calculated as the men they were fighting. To defeat an apocalypse, you often have to become something equally terrifying. The tragedy of Qutuz, murdered by his own brother-in-arms in the moment of his greatest triumph, reminds us that violence, once unleashed, rarely knows when to stop. Today the spring at Ain Jalut still flows. The valley is quiet. The Jezreel sun still bakes the earth, and the bones of thousands of horses and men have long since turned to dust. There are no massive monuments to the slaves who saved the world, but every time you look at a map of the world and see a diverse tapestry of cultures, instead of a single monolithic empire stretching from the Pacific to the Atlantic, you are looking at the legacy of the Mamluks. They were the outliers. They were the wild donkeys who refused to be broken. They remind us that even when the sky is falling and the experts say the end is certain, there is always a choice. You can surrender to the inevitable, or you can sharpen your sword, hold your ground, and wait for the giant to blink. If this journey into the darkest corners of history has moved you, please make sure you are subscribed. We have so many more stories of impossible defiance to uncover together. And before you go, I want to hear from you in the comments. In a world that often feels overwhelming, what is the invincible challenge you are facing today? How are you choosing to stand your ground? I'll be in the comments reading your stories. Until next time, remember, history isn't just what happened, it's what we chose to do about it.